Hello and welcome to Arly Knits. Today we're going to go over a great pattern if you've got a lot of slightly used skeins and you want to use them up but you don't know what to do with them. This pattern produces a lovely warm top with great wind resistance, hence its name. You will need 2 pairs of 4mm circular needles, one long cord, one short cord for cuffs and for the arms. You'll need a crochet hook, a darning needle that can fit through a buttonhole, 500 grams approximately of wool I've picked 5 different colors. You can use up whatever you have. You probably won't use all of that, but it's always better to have more than less. A pair of scissors, 4 stitch markers, and 5 to 6 3cm buttons. This pattern produces a size small, a medium, or a large. I will talk you through how we're going to do that, and let's go. Let's set up row 1. We're going to cast on 50 stitches onto your larger needles. I've picked color 1 to be my aqua blue color. For row 2, we're going to grab the 4 stitch markers and you will separate your stitches into the following sections. So it's knit 5 stitches, add a marker, knit 10 stitches, add a marker, knit 20 stitches, add a marker, knit 10 stitches, add a marker. And this should leave you with 5 stitches left. For row 3, we're going to grab color 2. For me, that is dark brown. And starting the row, we're going to cast on a stitch, and we're now going to go into alternating stitches of the 2 colors. So that's aqua blue, brown, remembering to add a new stitch at the beginning of every marker and at the end of every marker. So not only at the beginning of every row, but also at each marker, you will add a stitch at the beginning and at the end of the stitch. For row 4, we're going to go back to color 1 and we're going to remember to add a new stitch, and we're going to knit that entire row, and it's going to all be in color 1. So you'll now see a little color band. It's a aqua blue with little brown spots. Row 5 and row 6, we're going to introduce our divider color. For me, I've picked a gray, and we will knit 2 rows in this gray color. It will be the same story. You're going to cast on a new stitch at the beginning of each row. On the one side, we're knitting. On the other side, we're purling, because currently this is still being knitted in panel or flat. And when we get to the stitch markers, we are creating a stitch at the beginning and at the end of every stitch marker. So that's those 2 rows. For row 7, we're now going to introduce a new color. For me, this color is the blue, and we're going to knit that whole row in the blue color. Going into the next row, we're going to introduce another new color. I've gone with a beige, and I've gone with the alternating 1 by 1, knitting the blue, beige, and the next row is just a solid line of the blue. And then after that, we're going back to our breaker gray or whatever color you've picked, and we're doing 2 rows of the breaker color. Row 13, I have gone with a dark chocolate brown, and we've done a solid row of that. And then the following row, we've gone back to our aqua blue, and we've done the alternating spots. So blue, brown, brown. And then the next row is just a solid line of brown. And then we've gone back to our gray, the breaker color, and that's 2 rows of the breaker color. For row 17, I've gone back to the beige, but that's now the main color. So it's a row of beige, and it's followed by a row of alternating blue and beige, because I've paired those 2 colors together. And then the line after that is just straight back to beige. And yeah, just remember that we are still knitting in panel, which means purl on the one side, knit on the other side, and we are still introducing new stitches at the beginning of every row, and also at the beginning and at the end, or on the either side of every marker. And then after that, we go back to our breaker color, which is the gray, and 2 rows of that. So this is a 20 row repeat pattern. You will have created 4 main color stripes with little gray or whatever color you've picked, breaker stripes in between, and we're going to carry on knitting like this until we find the neck and shoulders to be long enough, otherwise known as the yoke. A good way to gauge that is to grab some measuring tape and measure from the nape of your neck to the nape of your armpit. And when you think that's long enough, you can stop knitting. We can then move all of our arm stitches over to a spare piece of scrap yarn, or if you have an actual stitch holder thing, those are great. I don't, so I use yarn. Just make sure that you tie the 2 ends together so your stitches don't fall off. And then you can continue in this 1 to 20 row pattern, removing all of your stitch markers because we won't be adding any new stitches now. We will just be knitting until we are satisfied with the length. If you're not sure how long that's going to be, you can take a measuring tape and you can measure from the bottom of your armpit to the bit where you would like your waist of the cardigan to end. And you can knit till you arrive at this length. For a small, this will probably be 3 sets of these row repeats, pattern row repeat. For a medium, it will be 4, and for a large, it will be about 5 sets. We can then select the color that we would like all of our borders to be, and you can knit 1 row in this color. For the next row, you will switch over to a double knit, which is knit 1 stitch, slip the next stitch purlwise, knit the next stitch, slip the next stitch purlwise, etc. And you can continue until you have 10 rows on both sides, bearing in mind that you're knitting 1 side at a time because you're double knitting. To close up the border, we're going to grab a darning needle and you will cut your wool so that you have about twice the length of the entire torso. Slip the first stitch off the needle and darn into that stitch from the outside of the stitch. Then slip the next 2 stitches off, put the stitch that is clearly from the opposite side back onto the needle so you don't lose it, and then darn into the next neighboring stitch from the inside. You will then switch over to the other side and darn into the first stitch from the outside and then into the neighboring stitch from the inside. Go back, pop 2 stitches off again, pop the one that's obviously on the opposite side, that should be the furthest away from you, back onto the needle and darn into the stitch that has already been stitched from the outside and into its neighboring stitch from the inside. You're going to weave backwards and forwards like this, darning from the outside through to the inside, go over to the other side, down from the outside into the inside until you have closed this whole side up. This stitch produces a pattern that looks like you've knitted the piece continuously. You won't be able to see the stitches and it just closes it up beautifully. Next, we're going to pick up the stitches along the flat side of the torso, running from the waist up towards the chest. To do this, grab your crochet hook and some wool that you have chosen for your borders to be, and push the crochet hook into each stitch, pulling that wool through and popping that new stitch back onto your needles. And you'll stop at the point where the panel begins to angle upwards towards the shoulders. Once you have all your stitches on your needles, you can go back into the double knit and you can darn up. When you have both sides, have 10 rows, you can darn it up and close it in the technique that we've just gone over. To add buttonholes, first make sure that you are beginning from the chest down and not the waist up. That's important because you want that first button to be right at the angle of your work and not at the bottom. So you're going to work 5 stitches and then you're going to cast off 5 stitches. To do this, you knit 2 stitches and then you bring the second last stitch over the last stitch. Knit a stitch, pull the second last stitch over that stitch, and do this until you have cast off a total of 5 stitches. This will leave you with 1 stitch left on your working needle. Make sure to include that when you're counting your next 10 stitches. And after 10 stitches, you will cast off 5 stitches, work 10, cast off 5, etc. until you get to the end of the row. When you work the next row, knit until 1 stitch before the buttonhole. Then into that stitch you will cast on 5 new stitches, which will appear to be 6 because it will include that stitch you worked into. And then you will grab a darning needle, slip those stitches onto the darning needle and turn it around so that the yarn is now facing in the correct direction, and slip all of those stitches off the darning needle back onto your working needle. And you'll work those stitches as usual and repeat at each buttonhole. When you work your next row, work your new stitches that you just added as usual. So that will be knit, slip purlwise, knit, etc. These stitches will be a little bit tight and uncomfortable, but it eases up by the next row. After this, we will pick up the diagonal stitches along the chest area and we'll double knit them until you have 10 stitches on both sides and close them up using the above mentioned darning technique. Lastly, we will pick up the neck and we will repeat the same steps, and make sure that you obviously have picked up all the borders on all the other sides too before we move over to the arms. Now we can go back to the stitches we set aside for the arms and we can transfer them onto our needles. You can pop a row marker back on to make sure that you know when you're starting a new row, because that is important. We are now going to be knitting in the round. That also means that we're only going to be knitting. There's no more purling because we're just going consistently in the same direction. Another important thing to mention here is that if you like to trim and tie your ends together with the fair L technique like I do and not carry them loosely behind, then just make sure that you're tying the two loose ends that are furthest away from each other together. This will ensure that you don't have any gaps in the joinery and that it all looks smooth and continuous. You can now go back into your 20 line repeat pattern and we can knit until we are happy with how long the sleeves are. And when the sleeve is long enough, we are now going to go into a knit 2 stitches together, knit 1 stitch, knit 2 stitches together. This is decreasing the size of the sleeve down to a suitable size for the cuff. If you have a set of double pointed needles that are a size 5 millimeters or less, you can reduce your stitches to approximately 40 to 50 stitches and revert back to the double knit stitch and knit until you have 15 rows on both sides. If you do not, like me, and you only have a small pair of circular needles, you can reduce your stitches down to 30 to 40, somewhere in between there, and we can go straight into a 1x1 rib knit. And you can knit until you have completed 18 rows, and then we're going to cast off using our elasticated thread. You can do this by cutting your wool and tying the thread and the wool together at the exact point where you will start knitting. Then you're going to turn your work to face the opposite direction, basically knitting back in the direction you just came from, i.e. backwards. And you're going to cast off going backwards. Doing it this way actually hides all of those elasticated stitches so you don't see them. They are on the inside of the cuff now. And when you're done, you can work all your loose ends in. Next up, we're going to grab our buttons. You can grab a big needle, a big sewing needle, some thread, the wool that you use to make the borders, scissors, and your buttons. You can cut about 1 meter of wool and a little piece of thread. Fold your thread in half and feed the wool through the loop that you've just made, and then feed that thread through the eye of the needle and pull it until the wool has fed through the eye of the needle. I am struggling, sorry. Next up, we're going to line up the two sides as accurately as possible so that we can see exactly where we're going to put our buttons. And once we can see exactly where the position of each button is going to go, you can grab a few safety pins and you can mark that point with the safety pin. Grab your needle with the wool in it and darn those buttons on. And then we're going to just close up the holes under the armpits, any other loose ends, and voila, your cardigan is ready. I don't actually block the cardigans when I do them in Fair Isle. I just run it through the washing machine. I do use 100% acrylic wool. It can wash at 30 to 40 degrees. Check your label to make sure that the same applies to you. Otherwise, you will have to block it. And other than that, please enjoy your new warm, wonderful cardigan. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and I hope to see you at the next one. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I love you guys.